Good morning. Wasn't the music wonderful this morning? Thank the Lord. Love the music. So we've been going through a series on the book of Genesis, the book of beginnings in the Bible, and this has been going on for several weeks now. You know, when I was a little kid, I had a great grandmother, not just a grandmother, but a great grandmother, and she was really the only churchgoer in my family. And I remember her telling me the story of Noah and the ark and all those kinds of stories. And if ever I had a question, though, I remember her always saying, you're not supposed to question, you just believe. But you know, there's a verse in the Bible that says when you're a child, you think like a child, you reason like a child, but then when you grow up, you become an adult. And this is an adult message today, okay? I'm going to ask you to put your thinking caps on to look at some of these accounts, and I think there's a lot here that will inspire us and challenge us. And so let's jump right in on part 2 of Noah and the flood. And we're going to read a lot of scripture, and going through the chapter 7, I'll give you a little background. What we've gone through so far is a story of the Garden of Eden, and everything was perfect. God created it perfectly, and yet Adam and Eve chose to eat from the tree that they were forbidden to eat from, and because of that they were cast out of the Garden of Eden. And then they had Cain and Abel children, and Cain wound up murdering his brother Abel, and they had another child, Seth, and created different groups of people. And as time goes along, things got worse and worse. It says people were continually choosing evil, and a lot of them lived hundreds of years, don't understand how, but they did, and it got worse and worse. You know, when I was working on this message a couple of weeks ago, I had the TV on in the background, and on the TV came up this movie about dystopian future called The Purge. Do not watch this movie, okay? It's a terrible movie, but they play a lot of these movies around Halloween, you know. And this movie, though, was about how in people's character, it was determined that it was so bad that once a year they would let people do whatever they wanted to, and all lawlessness would happen, and they would purge these terrible emotions. Well, this purge had been going on for over 1,000 years, from creation to this story we have today. And it had gotten worse and worse. Imagine if you let people live a long time who were evil, how much evil they could do, how much trouble they could get into. And this is what's happened. And so to put it into that, we have the story of Noah. And so Noah is found righteous by God. He is the one person that is, he and his family. And so God has him build this boat, this ark, and we're picking it up in chapter 7, verse 1. The Lord then said to Noah, go into the ark, you and your whole family, total of 8 people, go into the ark, because I have found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, and a male and its mate, and 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, and a male and its mate. And so there was like lots of 2x2s animals, and also 7 pair of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep the various kinds alive throughout the earth. And 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth. Some people think this is the first time it had ever rained. For 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made. Everything. And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. And Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters came on the earth, and Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons entered the ark to escape the waters of the flood that were rising, and the pairs of clean and unclean animals, of birds and creatures that move along the ground, male and female, came to Noah and entered the ark as God has commanded Noah. And after the 7 days of flood waters came on the earth, in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, so precise here in the time. On that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And on that very day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together with his wife and the wives of his 3 sons, entered the ark. And they had with them every wild animal according to its kind, all livestock according to their kinds, which, by the way, is, some people say there's, at least 8 million species of animals. How could all those get in the ark? According to those who believe it this way, they believe that there was kinds, in which out of the kinds came the species. So 7,000, they estimate, 7,000 kinds, total 14,000 animals, along with the 8 people. And every bird according to its kind, and everything with wings, pairs of all creatures that have the breath of life in them, came to Noah and entered the ark. And the animals going in were male and female, and every living thing as God had commanded Noah. And then the Lord shut him in, shut all of these in together. And so one of the first questions that my great-grandmother wouldn't have had, but many people would have today, is, was the flood historical or mythical? Is this story completely 100% true? I mean, how did this work? Was it, some people say it was just a myth? Well, I'll tell you, I believe it was true. I believe it was 100% true. And we'll talk about that today. I believe that the Bible itself attests to this. Noah and the flood are mentioned by Isaiah, Ezekiel in the Old Testament, the gospel writer Luke, Hebrews in the book of Hebrews, the greatest apostle Peter, and Jesus mention the flood in talking about Noah and the flood, and take it as evident that it happened. So, this subject is one of the subjects that people have a lot of passion about. And those intending sometimes to defend biblical truth look at this as the touchstone. But I want to say, to understand all this completely, how it worked out, is really not possible. Okay, to understand it completely, we do not understand it completely, and so we need to look at this and say, okay, there's arguments on both sides. Let's listen to the argument, and you think it through, okay, on where you call. Because if you say the flood happened, one of the questions is, was it a global flood or was it a local flood? Did this happen in one part of the world, or was it all of the world? How big was the flood? I know this, it was big enough. It was big enough, okay? So let's look at some of the case of it being a global flood. First, if God made it all, he can flood it all, okay? If God made the earth, and if he wanted to, it says in Genesis 1:1, God says that God created the earth. And then in verse 6, it said the flood of the waters came upon the earth. If God made it, he could flood it. 1. 2, a plain reading of the Genesis account seems to report a global flood. If you just read it, it says at first glance, it all sounds global, the way it's written, especially in English and the way we read it. Number 3, most Christians throughout history have believed in a global flood. For centuries and centuries, people believed in this. Up until the 19th century, that's when geologists and others came to the conclusion that this couldn't have happened as a global flood. But for throughout Christian history, many Christians have believed in this. Number 4, God can and does do miracles. Do you believe that? If you have faith, you cannot point at the resurrection and say, hey, the resurrection couldn't happen because a dead person can't come back to life. Well, we believe as Christians that can happen and did happen. And so we have examples, in our faith of miracles in our experience sometimes. Some of us have had experience with miracles. God can and still does miracles. And some of the arguments against this happening, I'll just give a couple. Okay, there's a lot of people that debate this, by the way. You can find debates. Ken Ham and Bill Nye have these famous debates. Other people do. And so if you want to watch that, go and watch it. But I'm not really going to refer specifically to that. But here's some of the things that people would talk about. What about the boat itself? Okay, I got a picture here of what the ark would compare in size to modern day cruise ships and the Titanic and the Queen Mary. And it was the thing about it is it's a wooden boat. Now, they never built so far a wooden boat this big. Now, they did build a boat similar to this it wasn't similar to it. It was a real boat. It wasn't just a boat like Noah's boat, but they built a wooden ship called the Wyoming in the early 1900s. It was a 6-masted schooner. The boat had difficulty because it would twist. It was made out of wood, and so it would twist this way, and it would twist this way, and it leaked a lot. And so it actually sank within a year and a half of when it was built. And it was built, you could say, by great shipwrights, by a large group of people. Noah and his family built the wooden ship with 8 unskilled people. Now, how did they do that? Well, because what I just said, that God can do miracles, you can believe God can make a ship that doesn't leak. Okay? And so that argument is not complete. I don't think it negates this actually happening. Also, Noah could have gotten help. It says he had 120 years to build the ark. You can do a lot of stuff in 120 years. 120 years, he might have gotten a lot of people to help him, and so he built this really large ship. And then I talked earlier about 8 million species, actually 7,000 kinds. That would be 14,000 animals on the boat. By the way, that's a lot of boat animals on a boat. You know, after Noah survived the flood and got off it, one of the things is he got drunk. And that's a terrible thing. He shouldn't have done that, but he had a probably stressful experience on this boat. There were 14,000 animals, and there's the National Zoo has 163 acres and has 400 different animals. And so, but we don't know. Maybe the animals went into hibernation when they got on the boat. Don't know. I know that they traveled to where he was. He didn't have to go get them. Another argument for why the flood was global is the geological oddities. Now, people would point to seashells that have been found on mountaintops and say, how did they get there? The ancient scholar Augustine and Aquinas lived in North Africa for a time, and they would notice these seashells on mountains and say, well, how did that happen? And so they believed in the flood. Number 6, human sin cursed all creation, so the flood covered all that was cursed. And so this idea of God being vengeful and killing everybody, God was saving us from ourselves. The sin had gotten so bad, it was the only way he could rescue humanity, or the only way he did rescue humanity. And so the idea of the flood covered all that was cursed. And number 7, cultures all across the world have flood stories. We have found flood stories, lots of them in different cultures. I've got a quote about this that I just went ahead and wrote out. So it goes like this. Many people have questioned the historicity of the biblical story of the flood, arguing that such a worldwide event is incompatible with modern scientific views of natural history. However, there is a record of a colossal deluge in the collective cultural memories of many peoples far from each other, all over the world, not only in the ancient Near East, but in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece. Flood narratives are found in India, China, among the ancient inhabitants of Ireland, among the Mayan peoples, Native Americans, ancient peoples of South America and Africa, even among the Aboriginal tribes of Australia. The fact that modern science cannot make sense of the flood phenomenon is not proof that this event never took place. Modern science failure to account for the flood is simply another evidence of the limits of science, especially dealing with something as supernatural as the Genesis flood. So, that's 7 proofs for option number 1, the case for global flood. Now let's talk about the case for a local flood. And again, as we go into this, know that none of us here were there to understand exactly what happened. But let me tell you the case for Christians who believe it was a local flood. First of all, which is a tough one to get around, is there's not enough water on earth for a global flood. 70% of the globe is covered with water. The oceans contain 97.5% of the total supply of water. 1.8% is frozen in glaciers. Fresh water accounts for 0.8% of total water on earth. So even though that's a lot of water, to cover the highest mountains on earth, to cover Everest, Mount Everest, how much water would it take to do that? I've climbed Mount Pisgah, okay, which is pretty high in the Smoky Mountains. And it was pretty high. Think of water coming all up that high. It would take 3 times the amount of water that's now on earth. Even if you counted the mist from if it was like a saturated fog, is still that amount of water would not hide all of the earth. And the weight of it would probably crush through the crust. This is the argument. Second, the Hebrew word for earth in this story is eretz, and it is often used differently at different parts of the Old Testament. It sometimes means the whole earth, and it sometimes means the promised land. There are places in the Old Testament where it talks about eretz, the earth, and the earth actually means the land, and it means specifically the promised land. And so there are some who believe that this flood did happen. It happened in the area in which Noah lived, and so when Noah looked out of the boat, he had no conception of the earth being a globe. He had no conception about what the size of it was. And so, number 3, there are ancient floods in this region that have been recorded. There was something called the Black Sea Deluge. I've got a picture here of a map, and you don't have to read any of that, but the Mediterranean Sea at one time, through glacier melt, overwhelmed the Black Sea. And the Black Sea is a lower elevation than the Mediterranean Sea is. So if you have this huge body of the water that rolls into the Black Sea floods. And Mount Ararat actually is a series of mountains called the Ararat Mountains. I think it's one of the reasons we've never found the ark, including because it's been so long ago. And it could have been even that Noah took it apart to build other things after he survived the flood. We don't know. But in any event, there is proof, scientifically outside the Bible, that there was this huge flood that flooded the areas where Mount Ararat was in the Middle East. Number 4. By the way, if you want to ask questions about this, don't do it now. You could come on Wednesday night. I have a Bible study every Wednesday night, which I go into questions and answers and in more depth. So if you want to do that, welcome to come. Number 4, geological oddities can also be explained by plate tectonics. What do I mean by that? Well, they didn't understand back then, but now we've understand that there's these huge continental plates that run into each other, and when they run into each other, it causes the mountains to rise up. That's what causes mountain ranges. And so if a mountain was underwater and then these plates come together and it pushes the mountain up in the air, that could explain why there's seashells on the mountain. That's another explanation instead of the water rising up as high as the mountain. Another explanation, the word for mountains in Hebrew is har, and it also can mean hills. And so perhaps if it was a local flood, it was talking about the hills of Ararat, and it would have made sense that the water did rise above the hills 20 meters, the way it's written. Number 6, a wind caused the waters to recede. If you read this story in Genesis, it says a mighty wind blew. Okay, well, if the whole earth was covered by water, a solid globe, which, by the way, Da Vinci said that if the globe was covered with water, it would be fascinating because there would be no movement of that water, because there'd be no elevation for water to run downhill. So it would all be very still, which is interesting. But I got off base. But if the wind blew to recede the water, which this is a flat area, not Ararat, but around Ararat. And so if this flat area had lots of heavy wind, you could see it blowing the water back. We see that happen sometimes in flooding in Norfolk and areas like Willoughby Spit. I would never advise somebody to move to Willoughby Spit. What happened with a hurricane could go away with a hurricane, I think. Anyway, number 7. What if not everybody lived globally at that time? What if in this history of the world, the Tower of Babel had not happened, people had not been sent to different areas of the world, so maybe the flood was big enough to destroy the people that needed destroying. And so you didn't have to flood China because their people weren't there. This is one way of looking at it. So I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but I would imagine if we took a poll today, there would be people that are Christians that have different answers to this questions. I want you to know this is a safe place. That's okay. The Bible says this in Job, chapter 38. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Because surely you know. This is sarcasm. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set, and who laid its cornerstones? Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line? So on what were its footings set? So this idea that we need to be humble when we look at this to think we know exactly what's going on. What we do know is the water washed over everything God wanted it to wash over. That's what happened. And what can we learn from this account? Well, I got just a few things I think are important for us to take away. First off, sometimes God saves you from it, and sometimes God saves you through it. What do I mean by this? Well, if you look back to chapter 5 and verse 24, in all this generation of so many evil people, there was a righteous person named Enoch. And Enoch was taken out of the terrible situation. It says in verse 24, Enoch walked with God, then he was no more because God took him away. And so sometimes God does that. Sometimes God will save you from a terrible disaster, will take you out of it, and he saves you. Sometimes he saves you through it. And this is what happened to Noah. Noah was not taken out of it. His family was not taken out of it. They had, can you imagine the work and the effort? Noah, for 120 years, is building this ark. Do you think his wife went along with him every day? Honey, what are you doing? Oh, I got to build the ark. Oh, come on. People would ridicule him, make fun of him, over and over. And so he was a person of faith, and he continued to be a person of faith. Sometimes God might heal your cancer, or sometimes he might deliver you through the cancer. God might save your marriage, or sometimes he might deliver you through a divorce. And the story of Noah is that they're not going to get around the flood. They got to go through it. And they do. And God gives them hope and faith to get through this terrible event that happened on the planet. Second thing, God is patient. I'm not very patient. I'm really not. And I get impatient at the red lights all the time with people in this town especially. And I get impatient because I want people to go, or, drive normally. But God was patient with people. He gave Noah the challenge of building the ark, but he waited 120, he gave him 120 years, and Noah preached for 120 years. That's a long time. And, I can imagine, at the very end, okay, and the water is started, but people still are making fun of Noah, and Noah is preaching to them. He's preaching to them, and then the door comes up, and they still are ignoring him. But God is patient. He waited 1,656 years between Adam in the beginning to when Noah come, and then another 120 years of Noah preaching. His patience is real. With you and me, he's got great patience. Don't think, I just can't come to church, or I just can't do that because I'm not worth it. God loves you. He's got a plan for your life. He can forgive you, and he's patient in his loving kindness. But the second thing, and this is true as well, God is just. And there is an end to God's patience. There was in this day. You can imagine how God could have closed the door of the ark. I mean, they could have drew straws. Who wants to close the door on everybody? I don't know, let's draw straws and you do it. Maybe they could have made a rope and pulley and had somebody do it. Guess who closed the door on the ark? Verse 16, the Lord shut the door. His patience got to the end. And so if we continue to read in the story what happened next, it says in verse 17, for 40 days the flood kept coming on the earth, and as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the earth. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated to the surface of the water, and they rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered, and the waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. And every living thing that moved on land perished, birds, livestock, wild animals, all creatures that swam over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in it, in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. People and animals and the creatures that move along the ground and the birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left and those with him in the ark, and the waters flooded the earth for 150 days. And so even though God is immeasurably patient, there is an end to his patience. And sometimes I look at some of the things that are going on in the world today, and it reminds me of like a constant purge going on, people doing such horrible things. The good news, and the news that should be sobering for us, is Jesus is coming again. True? It's true. And it says, Jesus said this, or the gospel writer Matthew said this. He said, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. Everybody thought everything was fine, and they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came, and it took them all away. And that is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. And according to what the Bible says, this won't be happen from water, it will happen by fire the next time. And so the good news is Jesus comes to give us hope and a new life. He comes to give us a future, and we can believe in that. But the sobering part is the other part of it is that there is a limit to God's patience and forgiveness, and we see that in the story of Noah. It's not in the children's story. And my grandmother, my great-grandmother, I don't know what she would think of this message, but she would be glad that I'm here. And part of the reason I'm here is because of my great-grandmother. And so I don't know where you are in your faith right now, but I pray that you would say yes to God, even though you may not understand it all completely, that God has a plan. He's had a plan that got Noah through this, and he's got a plan to get you and I through whatever we're going through. So I pray today that you might turn your life over to him.